Welcome. You're listening to The Hill by Thieves Theater. I'm Gabriele.
And I'm Nick, and we're Thieves.
Not exactly thieves, but beginning in 81, we called ourselves Thieves Theater. But we didn't just do theater, we did conceptual guerrilla outlaw art projects. Can I add that? Or what we called paratheatrical theater. Our goal was to disrupt and alter the social and political status quo.
Which really means we just like putting sticks into the anthill and watching the ants scurry and adjust their new reality, Their new status quo.
So in this episode, as promised, we're gonna get back to the Chinese man in the back, quote unquote, as we called him, or the Geomancer, as Nick referred to him. Yeah. And to Mr. Lee. So one thing that we realized is that nobody ever really referred to anybody's ethnicity or race. In other words, nobody said Black Ace or Black Larry or, Hispanic Tito or Hispanic Juan or, Arab Ali, white Billy Toyota and red. But for some reason, there was the Chinese man in the back, Chinese Jimmy, and the other Chinese guy, quote unquote, how he was known at the beginning, Mr. Lee.
Yeah, which was strange because we were in the middle of Chinatown, right? And everything surrounding the hill was Chinese. The people, the stores, the food being sold all over on the streets, strange food. You could find the weirdest stuff.
Strange to us.
Yeah, foreign food. And, the language was spoken, even, Mandarin or Cantonese. But also the signage on all the stores, was in the Chinese characters, in those pictograph-like characters of the Chinese language. And taking a walk around the surrounding blocks in the hill was like walking inside a foreign country. And
still is.
Yeah. And, I was afforded a lot of time to explore that foreignness. As we said, Gabriele was usually working my day job up at the warehouse. So I was free to stay on the hill, and I walked the surrounding streets. I wasn't quite the scavenger that the others were, looking for material items, like Louis was looking for cans and bottles to get a deposit on. Red was looking for all kinds of strange stuff, right? And finding it too. But I was caught very early into the metaphysics of the landscape,
yes,
I gotta say. Both the natural and the man-made architecture and signage. We had come to the teepee through the tarot deck, a kind of divining, and it bringing us there, I can say, because I was reading the tarot all the time back then.
Yeah.
And so now I was looking for further clues into the metaphysics of everything.
And you also went to the library a lot.
Yes.
Which I actually really appreciated. You were bringing back like various Xerox copies of things, research that you did about the area, the history of the hill, the people, the geography itself. And we had taken that history and we were telling everybody on the hill about the Native American background of the land. Because we wanted everybody, meaning visitors to the hill and the residents themselves, to understand themselves as part of a much bigger picture. So when you did all that research, you figured out that the name of Manhattan comes from the Lenape, Lenape tribe. And it was called Mannahatta, meaning hilly island. So the only documented evidence of an Indian village in southern Manhattan was on the banks of a large body of fresh water called Collect Pond.
Right.
And the highest hill in southern Manhattan was on its northeast bank. And next to that was a little bit of a smaller hillock where a small band of the Munsee tribe lived. The northeastmost division of the Lenape, right? They were called the Munsee. And that infamous $24 sale that is part of lore of the hilly island between the Dutch and the Indians was transacted at Werpoes.
Right. Which is?
And Werpoes was the name of the site and is translated as
Little Hill.
Little Hill. So topographically, the hill, meaning our hill, the hill, was also literally a little hill, little hill.
Called the Little Hill.
Called the Little Hill.
By the Lenape.
Exactly. So it was and still is the apex of a slight incline from every direction. The highest point in lower Manhattan, as it had been for centuries. And by the way, I said in a previous episode that it was the highest point in Manhattan. I meant to say lower Manhattan.
Right.
And you didn't catch that. So I wanted to correct that at this point. But
Right,
it's the highest hill in lower Manhattan.
Yeah, everything slopes down from the hill, the Little Hill.
Exactly.
From Werpoes, it slopes down until up top in Manhattan, it goes back up into the hills.
Yeah, and Inwood and
Right,
yeah.
of course. But what happened to me was, as I was thinking about this, as I was doing the research and everything, and then after Mel Chin had come, the Chinese man in back, from then on, was known, in my mind at least, as the Geomancer. And he became, in my head, a significant peer. We were both doing the same research in my mind. And no matter that we didn't actually speak to each other directly, just sort of gestured to each other. But, I saw a continuity, a continuum and synchronicity of the Little Hill.
Yes, can I just interject there? That's what I meant to say before. We wanted the people on the hill and the visitors to realize they were part of a continuity of the landscape. Hundreds of years of continuity.
Right. And so these Chinese characters and the graffiti sort of blended into a kind of a dreamscape for me. At some point when we were living up there, to use the analogy of the Matrix, right, the blue pill or the red pill, at some point I took the red pill and I went, people looking at that might say I went off the deep end, but I went into a different reality. But I was always exploring the same reality. So pretty early on in my research and my wanderings, I had convinced myself, even though ostensibly I was, to you and everybody else, normal. That is, mentally.
Relatively.
Yeah, mentally and psychologically normal. I was saying, right? I was still sure that we were living in a sacred site where time stared back at itself. And the future and the past were also the present. Where the cosmos was like as I had been reading, a living creature. And we were at, as Mel Chen had said, the mouth of the dragon, right, where everything was coming out of.
Right. Or as Robert Lanza, who I'm reading right now, with biocentrism, right?
Okay,
never mind.
Yeah, you want to go into it?
No. It all fits to me, though.
Well, okay.
Your consciousness is reality.
So maybe you did take a red pill, too.
Probably.
Okay. All right.
So the hill is at the center of Chinatown to this day. To the west of it is Old Chinatown, or, that's the place that everybody visits when they come to New York. That's the most touristy area. But to the east of the hill is New Chinatown, also called to this day Little Fuju.
Right.
And we had described that earlier, what the history of that was. So most of the neighborhood sits on top of what was, 3 centuries ago, Collect Pond. And in its pristine state, Collect Pond was a body of fresh water that occupied about 50 acres and was about 60 feet deep, and it had a lot of fish in it. And for the first couple centuries of European settlement of Mannahatta, it was the main source of water supply for the residents. And as the city grew, various commercial enterprises started moving in along the banks of Collect Pond, like, slaughterhouses and breweries, pottery works, tanneries, and they dumped all of their wastewater into Collect Pond, all these industries. So it didn't take long that by the late 18th century, the pond was considered just basically a sewer, right, and hazardous to health. And eventually they drained it into the ocean via a canal, which is how Canal Street got its name. Just like Wall Street got its name because they had built a wall separating lower Manhattan from above it to stave off Native Americans, to stave off, fight off the Indians. That's how Wall Street got its name.
Right.
Go ahead.
So Canal Street was because there was a canal there that ran into the Hudson River. Right. But it was in 1802 that the workmen began flattening the two hills, or the hill. There were more than two hills, but the surrounding hills of Collect Pond, and they were going to fill it in with that, with the earth from that, including Werpoes, the little hill. So they were going to flatten that. It was called Mount Pleasant at the time, and it's the adjacent higher peak was called Bayard's Point, which was named after the family.
Exactly.
So this remodeling or this deconstruction of the hills meant that they had to take away the old Bayard family crypt, which was built into the side of the hill. I love this story. Right. Well, the Bayard family had previously moved their deceased ones to another location, but the crypt was there, and the crypt was empty, except not. There was somebody living in it, and
the crypt was empty of dead people.
Right. There was one living person still in there. One of the city's homeless was living inside the crypt.
Except they weren't called homeless back then.
No. He was called, back then they were called Ragman or Hermits. There wasn't such thing as homeless. I mean, everybody lived in a hut originally when they got to Manhattan, right?
Presumably, yes.
Yeah,
they weren't skyscrapers.
No. No. But the most important thing to me was the fact that they stopped leveling the hill. All operations were halted, allowing him to live until the day the Ragman, the Hermit, or whoever, was found dead in his home. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Hermit did have a name. There was a record.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Wasn't there some kind of a Mr. Ed episode where they're reenacting the Columbus coming over and then looking through his telescope and seeing skyscrapers?
You really
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you're jumping the shark.
I know,
here.
I'm jumping the shark. All right, continue. No, okay. I'll continue.
Well, I don't know. I mean, not with the Ed story, please.
So there is a historical account that I want to read to you just because it's kind of funny. It was published in 1862. It was called The Market Book, written by Thomas F. DeVoe. And I want to read it because it has really funny descriptions for an official record of how they wrote things back in the day, like a singular and miserable looking specimen of humanity. It was one aspect of it.
You're explaining the Ragman there.
It's a great little piece that Nick found in the library. So it goes, near the foot of the hill on the southeasterly side was the old family burying vault of the Bayards, then known as Bayard's Vault, which had been or was thought to be the last resting place of the former generations of that old family. But in the march of improvement, which had begun there soon after the year 1790, its occupants were transferred to another resting place, and the old vault became empty, or at least only for a short period, as there came a singular and miserable-looking specimen of humanity and took possession of this much-dreaded quote-unquote tenement house. The marks of time, however, had left in it enough crevices and holes to ensure ventilation. And here this hermit, or ragman as he was generally known, lived several years. He wore the cast-off clothing given him, and these he patched with pieces of various colored rags or carpet, the rags hanging in every direction, which gave him a sort of hideous and frightful appearance, which sometimes alarmed grown persons as well as the neighboring children, who would seldom go near him. Many thought he was an old robber or murderer, and as he would not converse or seldom answer questions, he was somewhat feared and not much troubled with visitors.
Right. Thinking of the hill now.
Right. Think of the hill. Young Appleby often carried him cold victuals sent by his mother, Mrs. Bailey, and Mrs. Hopkins, when the hermit became quite friendly and would occasionally talk of some troubles or disappointments in England, and that his name was Captain Dundas. Winter and summer, he remained in this place, sleeping on his bed of rags, until at last he took his final sleep, where he was found buried in his family bed, the last tenant of the quote-unquote old Bayard vault.
Right. Yeah, I mean, when I found that story, I Xeroxed it. It felt like something magical to me, you know. I mean, I kept it almost like a talisman. Because the city at that time, when we moved up there, were clearing the homeless settlements all over, all the encampments. And I felt that the hill, the little hill, Werpoes, you know, Bayard's point was beyond any kind of city control.
And you know what? Maybe it was, because they threatened for years to raise the hill.
But somehow I felt it belonged to some greater domain. And the spirit of the ragman, hermit, was its protector. Even back then in 1800, it was being protected by this homeless presence.
And it's amazing that they let him live out his life, right?
Yeah.
In that old crypt.
Right, exactly. And I mean, as if the spirit of the ragman or the hermit protected.
Right. And so just to, because through some of this reading, it becomes a little unclear, I think, to recap, they were leveling the hills to fill in Collect Pond, except when they found this ragman, they quit until he died.
Right.
Which is incredible.
So in my mind, somehow the geography, the earth, the dirt of the hill made it a site for this eternal kind of reoccurrence of history. And I saw the personification and the incarnation of that spirit of the ragman and the hermit in the two Chinese men that were up on the hill.
Yeah.
Mr. Lee and the Geomancer.
Exactly.
You know?
And the fact that Mel Chin, in his own way, Mel Chin is that land artist that we talked about a couple times before.
Was looking for the same
looking for the same thing.
Yeah. So Mr. Lee was the ragman living in his tied up patchwood kind of hut. And the Geomancer in his underground cave there, not crypt, but cave, home. And I felt they were my peers, in my head, more than anybody else up on the hill, right?
Yeah.
And, and then, well, we'll get it to the end of the story when the Geomancer says, we were soldiers together. Yeah. And that's the way the whole time, almost unconsciously in my mind, I felt of these two people. And that's why it's harder to me to talk about them than the other people,
Yeah.
Especially Mr. Lee,
Yeah. So Mr. Lee is really hard to talk about. In many ways, he is the lead character in the story, if you will. He is a lead character in the story of our life. He looms larger than life to this very day, not just because of who he was, but also because of who he represents. He's the reason we couldn't tell this story for over 30 years. We still have a hard time telling the story. So he died while we were still at the Hill, but so did a number of other residents, right? And he died violently, as did some of the other residents. So the question is, what makes him so special? And that has to do with the responsibility we bear for others, with being your brother's keeper. Whether you want to believe that you are or not, you are. We're all interconnected. And it has to do with intention versus unintended consequences of your actions. It has to do with the very reason for this book and the podcast and why we need to tell this story now. It all comes down to Mr. Lee.
Yeah. Mr. Lee lived in the hut that was in between the teepee and La Ponderosa. Whenever anyone came to the Hill, any resident, any of our neighbors who were there would point to Mr. Lee's house and say, look, no nails.
Yeah.
He put it together with just knots, tying knots.
Yeah. And everybody was extremely proud of that, and loved showing Mr. Lee's hut off. And Mr. Lee himself, especially in winter, looked a lot like his hut.
Right, the
like
way he
all
dressed.
all bundled up. Like he always reminded me a little bit of like Kenny from South Park, the sort of squeezed face underneath.
Right.
All the layers.
And he was forever working on his hut. He was out there tying and retying the knots, the ribbons, the rope, whatever decorations he put up. He put like oranges up, which is a traditional kind of symbol for luck in Chinese tradition, right? And he moved the location of his door occasionally, put it one place or another. And he'd often sit up on top of his roof, and he'd be working up there and building it sort of upwards from...
Yeah, you know what? I was just thinking, in fact, how I took Polaroids of everybody to do their portraits with? I couldn't really get a picture of Mr. Lee except up on his roof. He was willing to look at me as he was sitting on his roof, tying and retying, and that's what his Polaroid is.
Right. Once I saw him tying a teddy bear up in the center pole on the top.
A giant teddy bear.
Right, up on the top. And on the outside walls, he'd write on whatever was on the outside wall, whether it was cardboard or a mattress or slate walls or skids, whatever was on the outside, he'd be writing and all the time he'd be talking to himself, right? And probably in like Cantonese or Spanish, but it was a kind of guttural gurgling that he was talking. Yeah. So it was completely indecipherable.
Right. And then one journal entry I remember saying that this morning at 5:30 a.m. the Chinese man next door was chanting again.
Yes, when he was talking to himself, it was kind of like a chant.
It was, yeah.
Right.
And he left every morning with a bundle of bags slung over his shoulder, and he'd come back with them at dusk.
Yeah, and of course the others, everybody else speculated that there was money in these bags. That's why he kept them with him all the time. Or why else would anybody carry the bags with him?
Of course, unless there was tons of money in there, right?
Yeah. And he also did Tai Chi in the park across from the... what is that, Washington Park, or I forget the name of the park, but anyway, the park right across Canal.
Yeah.
Big park. It had an open grass thing where many of the Chinese would go there in the morning. And later on, I learned it was interesting because in Kara's building, a friend of ours, the elevator...
On Christie Street.
On Christie Street, which was right across the park, the elevator operator was the person who went out in the morning and led all the Tai Chi movements.
Really?
Yeah.
Did I know that? and forgot
I don't
about
know.
it?
Maybe you did. Maybe you didn't know it, but Kara had told me that.
Yeah, she lived in one of those old-time buildings where you couldn't operate your own elevator. It had to have an elevator operator.
Well, it was a
right?
loft too. It was a commercial loft. No, Kara didn't live. Who lived there? Nora lived there.
Yeah.
Nora and Alex lived there.
Yeah.
But Kara, I think, told me the story.
Yeah.
Or maybe Nora did. I forget who. But it was the Chinese guy led the Tai Chi that was going on there.
Yeah. And
Anyway,
it was so beautiful at dawn every morning to
Right.
watch the synchronized. Yeah.
but then I'd follow him, of course, because he was my peer. And so I'd watch what he'd pick up off the ground.
And where he went.
Right. And he always, a lot of times he ended up on a little park area on Allen Street, you know.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah, he was a very sweet guy. A lot of my early posts when I referred to him as the other Chinese guy, I'd say stuff like, he's very sweet, one taco short of a combination platter.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's because we didn't know what he was saying, for one thing. But.
Well, it was more than that. It was just his whole demeanor and
we got things translated.
We got things translated, right. So he'd write on the outside of his hut, whatever he had tied onto the outside of his hut. And Jimmy, Chinese Jimmy.
Right, of course.
Who
else is going to know Chinese?
Well, yeah. Kano would translate, and some of the translations were like, person and money enter here to come and go safely. Home to people of many nations. The Queen of Germany's house. The Queen of Russia lives here. The Queen of England's house. So these were the kind of things he would write on the outside. And every once in a while, we'd laugh because we found out that he actually made perfect sense.
Some of the things.
Some of the things that he said. So Kano was this one baby-faced young guy, Hispanic guy who hung out across the street. And he spoke Cantonese and Spanish and English, of course, but he said he actually learned Chinese before he learned English.
Kano did, yeah.
Kano, but he was, maybe Puerto Rican, I'm not sure, Hispanic. But so whenever he was around, he would sometimes translate some of Mr. Lee's gurglings when he made sense. Because he often didn't. And he spoke a mixture of Spanish and English, this sort of...
Yeah, I remember one time, Kano was up there, because I remember Kano mostly because we were having a barbecue, and I had walked down and bought a pig.
Yeah.
Somewhere, I forget which street was selling real pigs, whole pigs, and we had roasted the whole pig.
Oh God!
On a spit.
I hate even remembering.
Well, what? Okay, stop it now.
Because we're vegan now.
All right, so we were roasting the pig, but Kano at one point came up and pulled the eyeball and ate the eyeball.
I remember that. He said it was a delicacy.
Right, right.
And Sammy ate the brains, because I remember telling him you could use some extra brains, and he didn't know whether he should laugh or not until everybody else started laughing.
But that was the time that Mr. Lee was translated by Kano, right?
Yes.
And he was saying that he was talking perfect sense. He was saying everybody else is all dressed and cleaned up except for me. And that was the first time that I seen him really be sociable with everybody.
Yes,
too,
it was the only time I really remember him making direct eye contact and being social with anybody on the hill. It's the only time I can remember. And he also once said, "You got too much sun today. Your face is all red." Kano translated.
What
to you?
Oh, you said
got
it to
sunburned.
Me? Yeah.
And we'd all laugh because usually he just talked to himself. So when he made sense, it was funny to us. And the two of you had a relationship going anyway. Without understanding a word. A little bit of Spanish. But.
Right. We had a turtle. One time, an Arkansas trucker couple brought a snapping turtle up there, and we built a pond. We'll tell that story later.
Yeah, because that is a much longer story. It also gets into this whole story that became a metaphor for survival on the hill. And it's a much larger story that also, they brought it because we were doing a play inside the teepee. And once we talk about that, we'll get into the turtle, the live snapping turtle that you built the pond for.
Yeah.
And, you know.
Yeah, they didn't bring it up for the play. I just stop you there.
Okay.
We'll talk about it later.
Sorry,
okay?
you're right. They didn't bring up for the play. You asked them to bring it up.
I didn't even ask them to bring it. Okay, I'll tell you the story.
I thought you did.
Okay, well, I'll tell you the story.
All
Do you want me to tell you the story now?
Okay, no. Otherwise, it'll be too long an episode and we'll be going backwards.
Okay.
I mean, forward, only to have to go backwards.
All right.
All right.
But in any
Continue.
case, yeah, but I would have continual conversations with Mr. Lee about the turtle, right?
Yes.
We made it into a kind of a comic routine between ourselves, you know, a fake kind of daily argument that we'd have. And I'd say, Tortuga del Sol. And he'd say, Mr. Lee would go, he'd insist, no, Tortuga del Luna, you know, so sun, moon. Both of us were saying the turtle belonged to one or the other.
The sun or the moon.
Right.
Yeah.
But Mr. Lee was loved by everyone.
Yeah, he was a neutral love object, almost. One time we thought that Sammy actually succeeded in hassling him off the hill permanently. For some reason, Sammy was all bugged out about the fact that Mr. Lee was, expanding his hut because he was very clever. Because his hut was all tied, a way of expanding it is by untying from the inside and tying it to the outside. So his hut kind of kept growing that way. And for some reason, it just really bugged Sammy, which really bugged me because in reality, nobody took up more space on the hill than Sammy and all his crap. Not to mention La Ponderosa, the compound that had enough space to rent out to other people in it, you know. So one day Sammy yelled at him and he didn't come back that evening. And he wasn't there the next morning. And he wasn't there that evening. And he didn't come back for days. And everybody really missed him, including Sammy. And although he always went his own way and didn't, as we say, interact much with people on the hill, but he was so charming and he represented stability and gentleness and guilelessness and kindness and, calmness in what was mostly a pretty explosive and cunning environment, right?
And then, one day eventually came back and everybody was like crazy happy about seeing him come back.
Everybody was so happy.
And he decided to ignore Sammy and all his yelling at him. And he tore his hut down.
Started dismantling it all.
Yeah, and rebuilding it, meaning he'd retie it all from scratch. Yeah. And I helped, I guess. I burned all the old cardboard that had been up there. And but everything else, the mattresses, the rags, doors, skids, etc., were just scattered around. And
but I think he himself, as I recall, took a lot of it out to the corner to be picked up
but then
by
everybody
sanitation.
started picking it up.
Everybody started picking it up, and everybody, including now a kindler, gentler Sammy, who was just super contrite about what he had done, was telling him not to put all that stinky stuff back up. And Mr. Lee agreed.
Right.
And he worked incredibly hard that entire day, making his hut smaller and taking the garbage away. And so it was like a glorious day on the hill. Mr. Lee is back. Yeah. Sammy and him have united. Everybody, he's now got a much smaller hut. He started writing on the outside again, probably something like the United Nations is under renovation. Who knows? I don't know what, right. But it was just a great day.
And then, we found out his story.
Yes,
after it was in the article that Jim wrote.
Right, which we'll get into later as well when we talk about the media. So his story was, he was 62 years old at the time. He came to the West when he was 10. He went to Cuba, where he had uncles. And he lived there for a number of years. And apparently he had his own grocery store there. And until the Cuban Revolution. And at that point, he said the UN got him to the US as a refugee. And here in New York, he worked in restaurants as a dishwasher and various other jobs. And he said he hadn't worked in 10 years at that point when he was being interviewed, but apparently he really, really wanted a job desperately. And he asked the journalist and the translator if they couldn't give him a job.
Right, right. So yes, I mean, that's his story. But I mean, how much of it is true?
We don't know.
Right. I mean, was he on the blue pill or the red pill when he was telling the story? Was he on the blue pill one time when he lived? I don't know. But he also said, what? He had 5,000 wives?
Which is why, grain of salt with everything
right.
that he told.
He had 5,000 wives and 100 children. And he said his wives just wanted his money, so he didn't have a wife anymore. And he also said he was trying to get help from the Lee Society. Mm-hmm. I mean, in Chinatown to help him, but somehow they hadn't helped him.
Right, and I actually looked this up, and the Lee Society actually does exist. There's still such a thing as the Lee Family Association.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah. It dates all the way back to the building of the Transcontinental Railway, and it has a Yelp page right now if you look it up. So I think there really actually was such a thing, and it's supposedly still located on Mott Street right now in the heart of Chinatown. Anyway, somewhere along the line, Mr. Lee clearly lost it, or found it, if you're Nick Fricaro.
Well, yeah, I mean, he was living his life.
But God knows what happened to him and his family, and exactly what his blue pill story was. It's hard to say. I remember one story during the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, in early 91. This was January and February 91. Nick brought a bunch of yellow ribbon to use on the Hill as a statement. We were going to make some kind of artistic statement about the war with these yellow ribbons, because back in that day, there were yellow ribbons everywhere. Tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree, and nobody really knew where that came from, and everybody was conflicted, and there was a lot of confusion and division about what it actually meant, or what the origin of the yellow ribbon was. Yes, Nick.
There weren't. No, you checked wrong.
No.
The origin of the yellow ribbon, I know exactly what it was.
Okay, please.
It was Tony Orlando.
No, there was a song.
Tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree. Yeah, that was Tony.
Nick, Tony Orlando and Dawn redid a version of a song that was older than that. I checked into this whole yellow ribbon thing.
Let me answer this.
This is where all the confusion came from.
No, there's no confusion.
All right, you guys look it up yourself.
I'm not going to.
In the show notes where you can see that I'm
How about I went to the Army when I was 18, and I did cadence to Around the Block, it pushed it. I did cadence to all these cadence songs, and one of them was a Yellow Ribbon song.
Yes, not Tony Orlando's and Dawn's though.
Okay, at that time, everybody knew it because of that song.
I know. Why are you getting so angry? He does this all the time. Why are you getting so angry?
Well, the other thing is saying there was a division. There was
a division.
Not really. The first Gulf War was the good war, quote unquote. That was saving Kuwait or something like that. The second Gulf War was the one that was the stupid one that Bush pushed us into for no reason, weapons of mass destruction. After 9/11, right. 9/11 was a place where everybody was scared in this country.
So literally 10 years later.
10 years later, yeah. 10 years later. That's where they started having the yellow ribbons that they put on the cars, the magnets and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And, I mean, in a lot of ways, after 9/11 was when Thieves Theater stopped doing their guerrilla work because you couldn't go into the street anymore.
You couldn't do any guerrilla work because now it was considered terrorism, not poetic terrorism.
Just terrorism. If you did anything that was disruptive in the streets. So, we stopped doing that. Although I remember the yellow ribbons because I was working in Philly at that time. So I was going down the highway there and seeing all these little flags as trash that people would put on their cars. These flags
that flew off the cars, and so the streets were littered with flags.
I-95 was littered with little baby flags, and I go onto the Walmart down there. Nobody in New York, in the New York City bubble, would put those support the troops yellow little flags.
Yeah, they were flat ribbon-shaped magnets, yellow ones that said support our troops, and they were everywhere. They were on the trunk of cars. They were everywhere.
Right. I go in there and I take that ribbon, that magnetic ribbon, off the car that was in the Walmart shopping center, Jersey car, and I put it onto the gas tank lid where you fill
the gas up so that you have to see it.
So the people would come out and see that their magnet had been moved to the gas tank.
Yeah, as a kind of guerrilla action, trying to remind people that this war is all about oil.
Right. But still we couldn't go out in the street and do anything, even a couple years after that.
Right.
But anyway, that's sort of off the...
It's off the topic, but, meanwhile, by the way, 30 years later, there are ribbons everywhere. Ribbons for everything. Pink ribbons for breast cancer, et cetera, et cetera. Right. But that also all kind of started back then. Anyway, you gave Mr. Lee
yellow ribbon,
a bunch of yellow ribbon. Who Mr. Lee loved this because he could use it all to tie up his hut, which was again growing larger and larger. Right. Take that, Sammy, who didn't say a word.
Yeah, he couldn't say anything.
But it was a great way to use yellow ribbon. It was like a little subversive action. Give Mr. Lee a bunch of decorative yellow ribbon, Right. All right, so now we've covered all of the initial residents that were first there when we arrived at the Hill. And from here on out, we'll get into various stories that led up to the eventual tragedy that marked the beginning and end of the Hill.
Yeah, and the stories will include our relationship with the press, which we just hinted at now, and also the largest ever NYC police corruption scandal.
That we were in the middle of. The 5th Precinct was part of that corruption scandal, was implicated.
Right, exactly.
And that gets into Nick's arrest. We'll get into that as well, which is all tied up into that corruption scandal as well.
And then the visits from school groups and celebrities and various filmmakers that came up there.
Yeah, some visit from the American Indian movement.
Yes.
Which was very eventful, and a lot more. All right, thank you again for listening to The Hill by Thieves Theater. And if you like what you hear, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and to hit that bell so that you know when our next episode is out.
And check out our website at thievestheater.org or follow us on Instagram and Twitter at TP on the Hill. That's TIPI on the Hill.
Thanks again for listening. Thanks. Chill pill for Nick now. Bye. Calm down.
That's not how it works, sweetie.